Well folks, it's fair to say that over the years, the World of Warcraft developers have found it pretty challenging to develop content that would offer an alternative to the traditional big three of Raid, Mythic Plus or PvP, which would allow players to progress their player power beyond what was available from open world content, with many of those attempts either not landing at all or having a bunch of bad effects for the game. With that history, I suspect I was not the only person who was pretty cautious about the new Delve feature prior to it going live in the War Within. While Delves did have a fairly bumpy first couple of weeks thanks to some tuning and scaling bugs, once those were resolved, they have, I suspect, turned out to be a bit of a pleasant surprise for many of us, especially the people who were the core audience for them. Delves, of course, are not for everyone. For many players who prefer to do the more difficult content in the game, Delve mechanics can feel a little bit, shall we say, dull at times. But I personally have found myself enjoying knocking out a few Delves every week, and whenever I visit a Delve, there's always quite a few people hanging out at the entrance, even towards the end of last season, when I suspect those Delves had little to offer most people gear-wise. The World of Warcraft developers have also expressed some satisfaction at how the Delves have played out, which along with a bunch of investment in Season 2 to enable even better player progression, heavily implies to me that this is a form of content that we can expect to become a more permanent feature of the game as we go forward into future patches and expansions. Something that I certainly hope will continue to be the case. Of course, with a total of now 14 Delves, even though the feature as a whole is a great addition to the game, not all Delves are equal, and I've certainly noticed that when I choose what bountiful Delves I go to do, there are certain Delves that I tend to gravitate towards and some that I will avoid as much as possible, and I thought it could be a bit of fun to do a little tier list and take a look at how successful the various different Delves have been. So let's dive right into the Isle of Dorn, and first up we have Kriegval's Rest. I really like the interior layout of Kriegval. The Titan style architecture along with the gradual descent underground makes it a great fit for Delve style content, and the final boss offers moderately challenging mechanics without being overwhelming. That said, I found the candle totem mechanic in Season 1 to be pretty annoying to deal with. Having to worry about it running out before I get to the next totem does add extra pressure to the run, but I didn't find getting the next totem to offer much of a payout for that pressure. In Season 2, this has changed so that we now pick up bundles of candles that we can then set out and pick up again. This is a more interesting mechanic, but except for the final boss, I don't really find the process of laying out the candles to be any more enjoyable than that Season 1 system, meaning that it ends up again just being more annoying than fun. Without the candle mechanics, I do think that Kriegval could have made it into the S tier, but as it stands, unfortunately, it's just a C. Moving on now to Fungal Folly. I've never been a massive fan of dungeons and raid interiors that have a very organic design, and the appearance of Fungal Folly is no different. Mechanics wise, being followed around by those exploding spores was just not fun for me, and when you take into account that the exploding knockback could actually kill your character and the potential benefits of being able to use them to harm enemies just never really felt like it was a usable mechanic. And trying to deal with them in the final boss in this delve was just painful. The jumping platforms mechanic did, I think, have potential to add a lot of interest to the encounter, but in practice they caused far too many issues, especially if you get in combat, for it to really work for me. Overall, this is one of the delves that I'm more inclined to avoid, and that makes it into the D tier. Next up is Earthcrawl Mines. While Earthcrawl has a fairly uniform brown colour scheme that's not super exciting, I personally found the layout with its little rail cart network, the climb up to an overhead bridge and descent back down, to offer a simple but enjoyable to navigate experience. While the chittering fearmonger's fear mechanic is annoying if it hits you, it's easy enough to avoid, and the Nerubian webs mechanic managed to offer a challenge that you felt you could play around, albeit I much preferred the Season 1 version over the new Season 2 one. The final boss is straightforward with well telegraphed mechanics, and as a tank who prefers not to have to move too much, it's quite a fun experience. Overall for me, Earthcrawl has become one of my go-to delves, and that makes it right up into the S tier. And now moving on to the Ringing Deeps, and we're going to start out with the Dread Pit. While the Dread Pit in some ways does have a bit of an organic design, as it's a more rocky cave, it's nevertheless one that I actually quite like as an interior. I also really like the stories in this delve, especially the one where you have to rescue the webbed up victims. Once you realise that the webs that contain the victims have a little fiery glow, finding them all without triggering any of the trap webs is really quite satisfying. The final boss isn't the best, with a little too much movement for me, but it's still decent enough to not detract from the overall experience. And that means we have yet another delve that's going into the S tier. And now it's on to the Waterworks. This is very similar to Kriegval's Rest, being another descent into a Titan-like facility. And it also has the same totem mechanic, albeit with a slightly different spin on it. Overall for me, Waterworks is just basically a slightly different Kriegval's Rest, but with a boss that's a bit more annoying to defeat. I also have an unfortunate memory of spending rather a lot of time grinding this out as my first level 8 delve in Season 1 in the first week when that final boss was badly overtuned. Overall, that really doesn't change its position relative to Kriegval though, and therefore this is another C tier. Over now to Halifall and the Mycomancer Cavern. This is another Fungarian delve, and it shares a lot with Fungal Folly, including the organic interior and those annoying spore mechanics. It does have a few more interesting quirks in layout, including a possible climb up a high pillar, but that is offset by the need to sometimes swim into water to find crates, which I personally didn't really enjoy doing. Add in what is a simply annoying end boss with far too much movement, and yes, this is a resounding D tier for me. Moving over now to Nightfall Sanctum, and I really like the interior design of this dungeon with a very intricate layout which includes buildings that we sometimes have to even go inside. The affix-like mechanics of avoiding void beams or void rings can be a little annoying at times, but with one of the stories allowing us to control the position of the void circles, it does feel like there are some genuine options to play around them. The only downside of this delve is the end boss, whose mechanics really just don't gel for me. Overall, this makes this delve an A tier. And now let's take a look at Skittering Breach. This opens up into an area with the Rubying architecture, which includes floating platforms and the option to be shot up onto some of those platforms from a giant crossbow. This creates a very interesting and to me quite appealing layout with a lot of potential, which is realised in several of the available stories. Unfortunately, the Shadow Realm storyline has a bunch of quite annoying mechanics, including having to kind of skate over the ground to remove void pools. If that story did not exist, this delve would have been at least an A tier delve, but unfortunately that story does exist. And therefore, this makes this delve drop down into the C tier. And then it's on to Sinkhole. Sinkhole is an underwater delve. Need I say more? Well, actually, I probably do. While underwater combat has never landed with the player base, the main reason for that, the need to work and think in 3 dimensions, is really not a thing here. In Sinkhole, we don't swim, we just walk on the ground, and this could have made this delve fine, except for the breathing mechanic. Having to run desperately to bubbles to stay alive and somehow manage to fight enemies while standing in them is just genuinely not fun. It is true that we can use water breathing potions to negate that mechanic, and that does make the experience in this delve a whole lot better. But even once I figured that out, those bad first impressions have persisted with me. The ability of Kobe's tricksters to go invisible mid-combat, leading you to switch to the victims, is, while atmospheric from a lore standpoint, also ultra annoying. Add in an organic layout that's not very visually interesting to me and a fairly dull boss, and this is my first no, just no tier. I don't know what it is about underwater areas in World of Warcraft, but even when they do have potential to be okay, something always kinda spoils it, and that certainly is true in this delve. Next up is Sprial Weave. This is set inside a large Nerubian building with a circular layout that offers a couple of branching routes, which somehow managed to add interest without becoming confusing. Add in some of the more varied stories in terms of vibe, and overall this is a bit of a winner for me. The story that has us destroy exploding vessels looks at first first glance to be a potential pain point, but the ability to bait enemies into those explosions and kill them that way turns it into quite a fun mechanic. The boss in Sprial Weave is one of the most challenging to defeat, but once you get the hang of it, it's also quite satisfying. I'm actually struggling to decide if this is an A or an S tier delve, but overall I'm going to make it an A because to justify an S I do have to be sure about this. Heading down into the City of Threads and we have Takrathan Abyss, which is another underwater delve. And yes, that breathing bubble mechanic is back, as are those Cobious Tricksters. On top of that though, in this delve you also have those sharks which can sneak up its new fixate on you and which at launch were quite overtuned, leading to some very surprise deaths. Also in the City of Threads we have the Underkeep. This is yet another interior Nerubian delve, which has a somewhat more complex layout than Sprial Weave, with doors that open and close as you progress. This makes the area feel much bigger and more varied than any of the other delves and adds a lot of interest to the encounters. And the developers have done a really good job of guiding us through in most cases, managing to avoid it becoming confusing at any point. One of the highlights for me is the Runaway Evolution story, which involves collecting crates to enable us to eventually stun and attack the big Nerubians that run through the halls. This is probably the most unique delve mechanic out there, and overall this manages to elevate this delve to make it into the S tier. With an initial tour of Castle Gart done, it's time to move over to the 1110 delves and start out with Excavation Site 9. This is another very organic design and it's probably the least visually appealing for me of the entire lineup, which is a shame as the mechanics are actually pretty decent. The story that requires you to defend the drill rigs is a little slow and I know some people don't like it. But honestly, I think that had this been set in a more appealing environment, it would actually have been quite a bit of fun. The one letdown gameplay wise though is the final boss, which for me was a fairly dull encounter. Overall for me, this particular delve comes together into what is just a mid experience. So yes, this is another C tier from me. And last of all, it's over to Undermine City and Sidestreet Sluice. Set in an underground basement, I really like the design of this delve. The staircases and platforms create an intricate layout that's enjoyable to explore, but on occasion can be a little confusing. I personally like the story variant that has us piloting little robots to defuse lightning pools a lot. But that story is offset by one of the other stories where a route is blocked by those same lightning pools and we have to use teleports to get around. Those teleports are a really good idea on paper, but I found that in practice it made navigating the delve quite confusing, leading me to just get very annoyed with the whole experience. Overall though, the positives do come out a little bit ahead. This was a delve that had the potential to be one of the best. But those navigation issues does for me drag it down and I cannot entirely put my finger on why. But it does nevertheless mean that this gets to have its own row in the B tier. And that's it, my tier list for the War Within delves so far. But what do you think? Are you a fan of underwater delves and think I'm just wrong about them? Or do you also prefer the heights of Earthcrawl Mines, my personal favourite? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, fun, or even just annoying, then you can let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel and find out when more of my videos go live, then be sure to also hit the subscribe button right now before you forget. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.